Chapter 46, the remainder of this chapter on ecosystems, looking at particularly section 46.3. Now, we've talked about how the living things interact within the ecosystem. Now we're going to look at some of the non-living matter which cycles through various components of the ecosystem. And to look at this, we have to see that the most common elements are those that I have listed here on the slide. The most common elements in living material, or which makes up organic matter. So very tops on the list, we have carbon, and then we have nitrogen, shown here. These are the periodic table information. Hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So these are the 6 elements that we're going to take a look at the cycling through the various components of ecosystems. Now, before we go on to carbon, I do want to mention that if we take 2 of the elements previously mentioned, hydrogen and oxygen, and through a chemical reaction form water, we see the very first cycle we're going to talk about, the hydrologic or water cycle, because in fact water makes up the majority of the material on Earth. So it is very abundant and very crucial to living things. So we find that water can be found near the surface as liquid water, or sometimes solid as snow. And when it is found in the atmosphere, it's found as a gas, as water vapor in the atmosphere. So let's look, and there's a cycling back and forth between the atmosphere and the water component near the surface. So when we look at the water that we do find on the Earth's surface, we see in this pie graph here, the majority shown in blue, 97.5% out of 100% of all the water in the form on Earth is found as seawater or salt water. So that's the predominant form. Only 2.5% is in fresh water. And then if we take this tiny sliver of the pie and we look at where the fresh water is found, we find that the majority of it is locked up as frozen water in glaciers or permanent snow cover, almost 70%. Then we do find some as groundwater. So this is water that's in the soil, in swamp water, or locked up again, frozen as permafrost, 30%. And only 0.3% of all the water on Earth is found in lakes and rivers. So this is a very small amount of water. Less than 1% of all the fresh water is accessible to living things that need to utilize that water to stay alive. So when we look at the water and we look at how much time a molecule of water spends in a certain component of the hydrological cycle, we see again that the time that the water molecules spend in oceans and seas, groundwater, and glaciers and permafrost, the majority of the time that a water molecule spends its time in is in one of these. Only in a much smaller and decreasing amount do we see that water molecules spend time in other components of the hydrological cycle, where we see in living organisms, a water molecule that enters a living organism is going to only spend about a week in that living organism before it moves on to another portion of the cycle. So let's take a look at the actual water cycle. You will see here that water molecules do move as shown by the arrows. So when you see the arrow, you see those are water molecules moving. Remember that water will be in a gaseous form as water vapor if it's in the atmosphere. It will be in a liquid or as a solid form when it's close to or below the surface of the earth. So how does this movement happen? Well, the movement happens and it's caused by sun energy or warming. So we see that there are different events which cause these water molecules to transition from the liquid or the solid form into the gaseous form. So we have terms like evaporation. So here's just the term evaporation. Then we have evapotranspiration from living things like trees. We have a term like sublimation, which is a direct conversion from something like snow into gaseous water vapor. And these arrows are all going in the up direction because we're talking about converting H2O from the liquid or the solid form into the gaseous form. So we have anything that we see in that direction is causing water to go up into the gaseous form. Then we see that there's condensation and precipitation, which allow the gaseous form to return to, and this arrow here is for evaporation. Condensation here is going to be in an opposite direction. So condensation and precipitation are going to return gaseous water into a liquid form or a solid form as snow or ice. We then have subsurface water flow, which is shown here. That's under the ground. So water can move or actually can be stored underground. And then we have surface runoff, like snowmelt runoff, or movements between fresh water towards the ocean. So those are surface runoffs, and that can mean anything from streams, rivers, and lakes carrying water into the ocean. During these kinds of movements, we see that they can also involve other elements that get dissolved and can be moved in the presence of water. So it's very important for the water to move so that we do have some fresh water which is available for living organisms like plants and animals. So we see flora, plants, and fauna. Animals are able to take up the water that they need. Now when we move on to looking at our elements moving through, we're going to start off with carbon. So this is the second most abundant movement in a biogeochemical cycle. And we see that carbon is going to spend time in living things and also in the atmosphere, as well as in a geological form, so in a ground form as well. So we see that there is movement of carbon dioxide in several forms. So when it is in an atmospheric form, it is found as carbon dioxide. So it's found as carbon dioxide. When it is found in a geochemical form, it can be just as carbon or it can be locked up in other molecules. So we can find, as I said, we can find the carbon in the atmosphere or in the soil. All carbon is found in all organic molecules. So all these living things, whether they be plants or animals, are going to need to have carbon available to them. Now we see that we can move carbon out of the atmosphere by allowing photosynthesizers like plants, or could be other photosynthesizers, bacteria or algae that we would see in the oceans. we see that they can take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So here we have our terrestrial photosynthesis taking up, and then we also see that there is a return of carbon dioxide from animals. Remember, animals can't make their own food by taking up carbon dioxide, but they will burn the sugars made by these photosynthesizers, and then they will release carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. So this is cycling the carbon through living things on the land. Now, when we look at cycling living things through the oceans, we see that marine organisms will often utilize their carbon from the carbonic acid, which is present in the ocean, instead of taking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So the cycle looks a little reversed, but we are still cycling carbon through marine organisms. Now, in the geological area here, we see that microbes, so decomposers in the soil, are able to break down living organisms, previously living organisms, and that can allow for carbon to be leached into waterways and enter back into the water system. We can also see that during the decomposition, they can form carbon dioxide, which can go back up into the atmosphere. Now, we can also see that there's other routes for getting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. A small amount can be placed into the atmosphere through volcanic action, which can, sometimes if there's a significant amount of volcanic action, that can make for a very localized increase in carbon dioxide in a particular area. Also, the breaking down of terrestrial rocks can release carbon into the soils. It can be sequestered in fossils, or it can enter into this microbial decomposition cycle and then eventually get returned. So remember, anytime you see an up arrow, we are moving carbon dioxide into the atmosphere through this way. And if we are seeing a down arrow, these organisms are removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and utilizing the carbon dioxide to amass into living structure, biomass. Now, as I mentioned, carbon dioxide is a major component, major source of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But we see that it can cycle back and forth between carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and carbon dioxide dissolved in oceans, primarily oceans. Now, this dissolved carbon dioxide in a second step in a waterway can combine with water to form a reversible action. Anytime you see these equal signs that have the little additions, that means the chemical reaction can go this way as equally as it can go this way. So the carbon dioxide that gets dissolved into water bodies can combine with the water molecules and form an acid called carbonic acid. Carbonic acid. Now, carbonic acid can then undergo a reversible reaction where we're going to break off one of the hydrogens, and that leaves the remaining hydrogen with a carbonate ion to form what's called bicarbonate ion. This is the bicarbonate ion. This can go back and forth, but it will go this way to form bicarbonate ions, which is a primary form that we find our carbon dioxide in the oceans. So this will help to keep the oceans at a proper pH. Step 4 would be this bicarbonate ion would undergo a reversible reaction where we'll pull the hydrogen, another hydrogen off, and we will release a carbonate ion. Now, when this happens, this ion can combine with calcium and form calcium carbonate, And that's a major component of shells that we find. So we can form shells. Organisms can undergo this reaction to pull the carbonate off so they can combine it with calcium to form calcium carbonate for shelled organisms. Our next major cycle we're going to talk about is the nitrogen cycle. Now, the nitrogen cycle, we have an atmospheric component, and again, we have a ground component as well. In the atmosphere, it's as nitrogen gas. In the ground, it's mostly tied up in nitrogen molecules, which are acted upon by bacteria. So bacteria play a very crucial role in the movement of nitrogen through different components of an ecosystem. They are really the only ones that can take nitrogen out of the atmosphere. You see this big down arrow. It's the only down arrow. Nitrogen fixing bacteria can pull nitrogen gas out of the air and make it in a form that living things can use. So here we see terrestrial food webs. Plants will take up this nitrogen that's fixed by bacteria, and then it will start to move through the food web, through the various trophic levels. When plants and animals die or form nitrogenous wastes, those go back to the soil. Then we have a group of bacteria which can break down those nitrogenous wastes and convert them back into nitrogen gas. So a few different steps, all by bacteria. All of this is done by bacteria, and this forms the major movement of nitrogen. Now on the ocean side, and again, because oceans are the primary form of liquid water, we see that there are also bacteria that live in the oceans, which are able to do the same kind of movement of nitrogen as the ones that are present in the soil. So there are soil and ocean bacteria which are able to move nitrogen as a take it and form it into compounds that living things can use, and then return it to the atmosphere. Now, burning fossil fuels and adding fertilizers to the land can overwhelm the amount of nitrogen which is available to living things, and that can cause a great deal of problems. So it can overwhelm these systems that are trying to remove the nitrogen and recycle it back into nitrogen gas, both in the oceans and on the land. And this can cause a great deal of pollution because it allows for these bacteria to grow rapidly, and it causes also algae to grow rapidly because there's lots of nutrients that they can use. And so this can cause a lot of pollution aspects to the ecosystem if we have overwhelming nitrogen because of overuse of fertilizers or the burning of fossil fuels, which can release nitrogen components into the atmosphere. Our next elemental cycle is the phosphorus cycle. Now, phosphorus is found in nucleic acids, and it is very important for nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. I forgot to mention that in the nitrogen cycle, the reason why living things need nitrogen to cycle is because nitrogen is found also in nucleic acids, DNA and RNA, as well as in proteins. So it's very important for nitrogen to cycle. In the phosphorus cycle, the phosphorus is found in nucleic acids, DNA and RNA. So we need that to cycle. You notice here that there are several sources of phosphorus, but it is only in land-based either soil or water-based systems. There is no atmospheric form except for a little bit of aerosol that might be produced by volcanoes. So really not much in the way of an atmospheric cycle for phosphorus. So most of phosphorus is tied up in rocks or ocean sediments, which then degrade over time so that the phosphate ions get dissolved in the soil, and they get then added into lakes and streams, so therefore plants can take up the phosphorus, use that phosphorus to make their biomass, and then that gets transferred up the different trophic levels to produce primary producers, to primary consumers, etc., etc. And then when these organisms die or their wastes are released, that gets added back into the soil, and we have a similar breakdown, and then it gets recycled back into the water. So as far as in the ocean, we have a similar kind of thing. Phosphorus, which is dissolved in lakes and streams, makes its way into the oceans. Then it gets into the food webs. When these animals die, then it gets into ocean sediments, which can get taken back up by the land, also dissolved into ocean water. But you see, there's no returning of the phosphorus from living things back up into the atmosphere. Similarly, as we saw in the nitrogen cycle, fertilizers contain phosphorus, so additional adding of fertilizer to the land can increase the amount of phosphates which are added into oceans and fresh waterways, and this can cause an excessive problem, particularly in oceans, where we see the added phosphorus causes massive algae blooms which use lots and lots of oxygen, and that leads to other organisms in the food web, higher up in the food web, dying. And we have what we call dead zones. So dead zones would be areas in oceans or where fresh water meets oceans, where essentially all of the upper trophic levels have died. There is no way for them to live, because there's not enough oxygen present. It's all been taken up by the excessive growth of algae. Our last biogeochemical cycle is the sulfur cycle. Sulfur is very important to cycle because it is found in proteins. There's a particular amino acid called cysteine, and amino acids make up proteins. This one amino acid, because it contains sulfur, can form disulfide bonds between different sulfur amino acids, different cysteine amino acids. This allows for the folding or bending of proteins, which is very important for their activity. So when we look at the sulfur cycle, we see that there is an atmospheric component of sulfur. So we have this atmospheric component, this sulfur dioxide, and then this sulfur dioxide can fall out in rainwater, precipitation, snowfall, land on terrestrial ecosystems, and end up in both soil and runoff in freshwater and marine ecosystems. Then living things can take up the sulfur components, so plants, then animals, etc., can take up them, and when the terrestrial ecosystem, when the terrestrial living things die, then they decompose, and we see that there is a return or a breakdown of sulfates back into atmospheric sulfur. Now we can have some additional sulfates which are added because of volcanic eruptions, which can put some sulfur in to the atmosphere. And there is some heavy human emissions that can happen. So this occurs through the burning of fossil fuels. We can see that sulfur in the form of hydrogen sulfide can get added into the atmosphere. Once in the atmosphere, it can join up with water, form sulfur dioxide, and then when this excessive sulfur comes down and precipitates in rainwater, it can bring sulfuric acid, which is what we call acid rain. Now over here on the marine ecosystems, we see that there is a cycling, no atmospheric component, but a cycling of marine life taking up available sulfur into their biomass. It can then be released into marine sulfate ions when these organisms die, and then it can be recycled when it's joined up with iron. So an iron sulfate is called pyrite, and that can make its way back into soil sulfates and follow this. This is a much longer cycle process, but it definitely returns those sulfates to the cycle. Also, in these marine ecosystems, this is where we have chemoautotrophs. Remember those we introduced. Chemoautotrophs, way deep at the bottom of the ocean, will utilize marine sulfates as their source of energy. And they don't use sunlight because they don't have access to it. The sunlight doesn't penetrate that deep, but they can use the sulfate molecules as their energy source to make the food that they need. So biogeochemical cycles are incredibly important, and the proper balance of these cycles is important to maintaining healthy ecosystems.